So, this is a verse out of the first book of the Bible with creation. And God said, "Let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees bearing fruit, in which is their seed, each according to its kind on the earth." And it was so. And we're going to look at how science makes that last little phrase more understandable, and just magnificent complexity, design, engineering, efficiency that is happening in nature. And so this week we're focusing on plant and soil ecology especially, but this topic in particular, we're going to take the macro, kind of the fine-tuning of the universe, and down to the micro, and kind of take all the concepts that we've been talking through so far and wrapping it up in a neat little package with a bow on it. And by the end of this class, you're going to be able to pass a test on photosynthesis. I'm just kidding. The goal is not to actually teach you how photosynthesis works, but the goal is to actually help you to see how efficient, how tiny, how brilliant, how complex the engineering, the efficiency is that we see in nature through plants and soil especially, so that hopefully our awe and wonder grows. And I do hope that it would actually just inspire and encourage you to peer more deeply into science, and let's dispel this ridiculous notion that science and faith are somehow opposed to each other, because science is an amazing tool to study the book of nature. And Paul made it very clear that God has made himself known in the things that have been made. So he wrote this book for us to go and study. And that's what the founding fathers of the scientific revolution set out to do. And I'm going to propose today that we return science back to its original intended purpose. And it's going to be beneficial to the world. So I want to look at photosynthesis. If you want, you can follow along in your workbook. Some of these diagrams are there, so it maybe helps you not take so many notes. But this is a cutaway of a typical plant leaf and the cellular structure inside that leaf. You've got the epidermis on the top and the bottom, and then you have in the middle these two categories of cells called the palisade and mesophyll cells, that top section right there with the red circle around it. And then you've got the spongy mesophyll below that, which has a lot of air space in that. This is where oxygen and CO2 diffuse both into and out of the plant leaf. Because remember, we breathe in oxygen and breathe out CO2, and we have this symbiotic relationship with plants. That is a necessary relationship for our ecosystem and for life to exist at all. Plants breathe in that CO2, and then they breathe out oxygen for us. So then you have down at the bottom of the cell, the underside of a plant leaf, you have guard cells, which essentially are the valves that open and close this breathing apparatus for plants so that oxygen can escape and CO2 can enter. Now, what I want to do is we're going to zoom in several layers, and I'm hoping that I can give you some idea of how small this is in the way that it's happening. So we're going to zoom in right there where that red circle is into that palisade cell, and this is essentially what you're looking at. I'm oversimplifying all of this. Up here you have a chloroplast, you have a nucleus, you have a vacuole. Vacuole is the cell structure inside of plants that collects water. And if you see a plant drooping, that means that water is kind of evaporated. And as it replenishes that water, the plant perks back up again, kind of like a balloon filling up, if you will. Again, I'm way oversimplifying all of this, because we could teach an entire semester just on photosynthesis and still probably not cover the complexity of it. Now, to give you a little bit of an idea of the scale here, we've got this is a human hair. You can fit roughly 5 to 7 palisade cells across the width of a human hair. In reality, this is actually not wide enough. That human hair was about the width of the entire stage to fit roughly 5 to 7 palisade cells in that. Then we're going to zoom in again onto what is called a chloroplast. This is where photosynthesis is happening. So this is one of those chloroplasts that we're zooming in on. And in these little coin-like shaped cells are called thylakoids. And then a stack of those is called a granum. And then outside of that thylakoid is called the stroma, which will be important when I talk about some of the photosynthesis photosynthesis reactions here in just a minute. So we're going to zoom in once again on one of those coins, and I'm just going to kind of give you a side cutaway of what that looks like. So in this, you have what's called a lipid bilayer. Casey talked about this last week in our DNA and cell structure class. This is essentially what that looks like. It's bi because there's two, and then you have all of these kind of stacked up. But then, again, this is very, very, very oversimplified. In and amongst all of this lipid bilayer, you have tons and tons, literally thousands in one of these thylakoid, thousands of complex molecular machines that are doing this photosynthesis work. And again, inside the thylakoid and then outside the thylakoid is called the stroma. And we're going to zoom in again into that little section of that lipid bilayer, the membrane of this cell, if you will. And we're going to take a look at photosynthesis. This is where that lipid bilayer is jam-packed full of molecular machines that are brilliant and efficient. And to give you an idea of scale now, our human hair is now over 2 miles wide. Just to help you understand the absolute nanoscale molecular biochemistry that is happening in this laboratory right now. So I want to darken this so that I can walk through this process with you. These are called the light-dependent reactions in photosynthesis because they are powered literally by light. These are solar-powered biochemical factories that are happening right now. And if you think about the solar panels that we design as humans, the more efficient ones are on a tracking system that can actually track and follow the sun so that it can maximize its power consumption and capture, if you will. But a plant has that tracking mechanism built into it. If you ever set up a time-lapse camera just on a sunflower or a plant that you have in your yard, it will literally follow the sun as it goes to maximize its solar capture here. So what happens is you have a photon, which is just an energy particle from the sunlight, hits what's called photosystem 2 or PS2. You have some diagrams of these in your book there. Now, this is called photosystem 2, even though it starts the process, and it's really kind of all happening at the same time. But it was called photosystem 2 because it was the second one discovered. Scientists first discovered photosystem 1, and then this was the second one that they discovered, which is where that name comes from. So, this is also called the oxygen evolving complex. It is a magnificent molecular machine, biochemical factory that first splits water so that as the plant consumes water, it splits that water, sends oxygen into that spongy mesophyll so that it can be breathed out of the plant. This is where we get oxygen for us to breathe in. It then takes a proton and an electron because when this photon hits this photosystem 2, which is also called P680, that's important to remember, it excites an electron in photosystem 2 that then gets passed to the electron transport chain, which I'll talk more about in just a second. And then this splitting of the water molecule replaces the electron that gets sent down this electron transport chain, and it takes a proton and sends it inside the thylakoid, inside that coin-shaped cell, if you will. That begins to build pressure, and then as this electron comes over here to what's called plastoquinone, it's another very complex enzyme that also takes protons from outside the thylakoid and pumps it literally into the thylakoid inside. So now you're building up this pressure, kind of like a balloon that's building up pressure. That's really important. We'll talk more about that in just a minute. Passes this electron over to the cytochrome complex, which then passes that over to plastocyanin, which then passes that electron over to photosystem 1, and then light, photons then re-excite that electron because by the time it's done all of this work to pump and all this stuff, that electron has lost some of its energy, so then it gets re-energized by another photon down here. All of this is happening lightning fast. This has been called one of the most, if not the most efficient system in the known universe. And by efficient, I mean input to translated output. It's phenomenal. So then you've got these other molecular machines over here that are creating what's called NADPH. Again, I'm very oversimplifying this for the sake of time. And then down here, further down the way, you have what's called ATP synthase, which we'll talk about, and that is phenomenal. But it's important to understand that now these protons are entering inside this thylakoid and building up some pressure, which will then go out of the ATP synthase, which is literally like a hydroelectric generator, a power generator. And you've seen me wear this shirt. Casey talked a little bit about this last week. I run on ATP, you run on ATP. Every living thing in the known universe is powered by ATP. It is literally the energy source of life. So, quick summary of all of this. You've got sunlight, hits photosystem 2, water splits, oxygen is released, the electron is excited. That goes to the electron transport chain where a hydrogen or a proton is pumped into the thylakoid that then gets sent over to ATP synthase. Photosystem 1, NADPH is produced. So now you've got ATP being produced by ATP synthase and NADPH being produced by that complex of enzymes over there. Both of those then get power what is called the Calvin cycle or the dark reactions. It's not happening in the dark, it's just that they aren't dependent on light because they depend on the light reactions to create power to power the Calvin cycle. Now, so remember I told you to pay attention to that P680 and P700. Why are those numbers there? Because in the visible light spectrum, you have all of these different ways that we perceive as different colors based on the wavelength. Now, number one, you have to zoom out a bit and realize that it's actually magnificent that visible light is what powers life, literally what powers life. And yet our sun, that happens to be the radiation that it produces the most of, and our atmosphere blocks additional harmful radiation, but allows this visible light to come through, both in our atmosphere and also in water, because we have plants that live in water. It's remarkable how this universe and our earth is fine-tuned for all of this to happen. Now, what powers those guard cells in the stoma underneath the leaf to open and close so that the plant can breathe is these wavelengths over in the blue spectrum, and what is powering photosynthesis down here in the light reactions is these two wavelengths, 680 nanometers and 700 nanometers. Remember that photosystem 2 is P680. It's powered by that wavelength of light, and photosystem 1, P700, is powered by the 700 nanometer wavelength. Now, why do you think that the stoma that triggers the plant to breathe would be powered by blue light? Because what do you have in the morning? Blue light. It's literally a signal to the plant to say, wake up, it's time to get to work. It's literally a timing signal for the day to power the plant to say, open, it's time to start breathing, it's time to trigger photosynthesis. And then what do you have more of in the middle of the day? You have those wavelengths in the red spectrum to power the light reactions. It's an extraordinary thing. Now, we have these enzymes. This is in your book. Photosystem 2 has over 20,000 amino acids. Now, let me help you understand this. You might think of amino acids and proteins like letters and words. Amino acids are like the letters, combine them together. You've got the proteins, which are the building blocks of life, are these letters that combine to form a word. Imagine, if you will, a word that is 20,000 letters long. That is how many amino acids are necessary to link up in exactly the right order, or you don't have photosystem 2. That cytochrome complex has over 5,000 amino acids. Photosystem 1, over 20,000 amino acids, and ATP synthase, over 5,000 amino acids. Now, these are rounding numbers because depending on the plant species, these vary a little bit, or whether it even is a photosynthetic bacteria. These might vary a little bit, but roughly these are round numbers. Now, this is T.S. Eliot's poem, The Wasteland, which has 13,000 letters. If these letters are not in this exact order, you don't have this anymore. It turns it into gibberish, right? This has to be in exactly the right order, or this poem doesn't exist. In the same way, these amino acids have to be in exactly the right order, or these complex molecular biochemical factories do not work. It's an extraordinary reality. Now let's go a little bit further down our photosynthesis process to ATP synthase. It is like a hydroelectric generator. Not like, it is that very thing. Remember I mentioned to you that inside the thylakoid you have this pressure building up from protons from photosystem 1, sending protons inside, that cytochrome complex pumping protons into the thylakoid that's kind of building up this pressure. It's the same reality that you have with a hydroelectric generator system here, where you've got a dam. It's the only time in church that you're allowed to say dam. And then you have this water that builds up, and then gravity wants to equalize everything to make it to create an equilibrium. So this is what's called a gradient. So inside the thylakoid, this pressure that's building up is a gradient that ultimately will be pushed through photosynthesis, which spins this generator. It's literally a power generator that then creates power that we are able to use. That is exactly what ATP synthase is doing inside of your body right now. But in every single cell of your body, there are, in a single cell, millions of ATP synthase that are powering your life, that are powering my life, that are powering everything that is alive. Now I want to take us over to the dark reactions, or the Calvin cycle, which again is outside of the thylakoid, in the stroma, in this water aqueous solution that's outside of these little coin-shaped cellular discs here. So again, this is happening outside the thylakoid right there. And I'm not going to go into this into a ton of detail just for the sake of our time. We don't have enough time to go into this. But rubisco is the hero of this. Many scientists believe rubisco is the most numerous enzyme in the world, because it is in everything that does this photosynthesis process. All complex life, everyone, depends on this enzyme right here, because plants are what create these carbohydrates by taking carbon out of the atmosphere, CO2, and creating carbon chains, literally biochemical factories doing biochemistry at crazy efficient nanoscale efficiency. This is the deal that's doing us. This starts this Calvin cycle, these dark reactions. They're not in the dark, but again, they just aren't powered by the light, which is where the name comes from. For the sake of time, I'm not going to go through all of this, but this is a list of all of the enzymes in the Calvin cycle and roughly how many amino acids are in each one. You take any of this away, you even take away the amino acid part of the protein complex, and it becomes gibberish. It does not work. It does not create a selective advantage. So when you think about the evolution, natural selection, false narrative, in order for this to be built in small successive changes over time, each change has to make it more fit, because it's a survival of the fittest narrative. The problem is, take any of this away and it becomes gibberish. It does not make it more fit. It all has to exist at the same time for it to even survive, much less be fit enough to make this happen. So this is magnificently complex and efficient. And even if you're a meat eater, you depend on plants, because the cows that you're eating depend on plants. Now I want to zoom out through a telescope for just a minute, because this is our periodic table. And the green elements there, you've seen me wear this shirt, I wear this periodically. These green elements are what is necessary for plant life and really all life. So if you've ever bought fertilizer from Home Depot or Lowe's, you will see on the back a nutrient analysis of that fertilizer, and you're going to have these macro and micronutrients in it. But it's magnificent that these even exist at all, because in the beginning of the universe, science shows this. It was essentially protons and electrons, quarks, that are kind of bouncing about in this crazy chaos of an explosion in the beginning. And listen to how finely tuned that explosion had to be in order for there to even be elements on the periodic table to exist, in order for life to exist at all. Stephen Hawking, an atheist, scientist very well known, said if the rate of expansion 1 second after the Big Bang, after the beginning, had been smaller by even 1 part in 100,000 million, the universe would have recollapsed before it ever reached its present size. What is he saying? You have essentially competing forces that are happening at the same time. You have this explosion that's pushing everything out, and then gravitational force that's pushing it, that's wanting to pull everything back together. If that expansion rate is not exactly right, either things expand too far away to where gravity can never pull them together again to create stars, which is where stellar nucleosynthesis happens, which is where all of these elements begin to be built in the first place. So they either expand too far away from each other, or gravity pulls them together and it never even starts to begin with. It becomes too dense. It essentially redoes that incredible density that was at the very beginning. Then Roger Penrose said, now this tells us how precise the Creator's aim must have been, namely to an accuracy of 1 part in 10 to the 10 to 123. Listen, here's the scale of odds that we're talking about. There are only, it's estimated, roughly 10 to the 80 particles. Now I'm talking about grains of sand, I'm talking about particles in the entire universe. Right? So if you think about this right here, there's just not enough probabilistic resources to make any of this happen. This is a couple of quotes from Fred Hoyle. He's the guy who actually coined the term. He's an ardent atheist. Coined the term Big Bang, and it was actually a derogatory term to sort of poke fun at the creationists, if you will. Oh yeah, this Big Bang happened. Because at the time, they believed that when he coined that term, that the universe was static and eternal. But the science over and over and over again continued to affirm that the universe, all of nature itself, had a beginning. The science shows that. We covered that a lot more in God's Fingerprints Part 1. He spent a good portion of his life, decades, researching just carbon. How in the world did we get carbon to have carbon-based life? So life is all based on these complex carbon chains, right? So you have to have carbon. That's why you probably have heard that phrase that we are a carbon-based life form. It is miraculous that we have carbon at all, that we have this periodic table at all, because we cover this more in God's Fingerprints 1.0. But there's what's called the 4-nucleon crevasse. It's nearly impossible to get from helium and add protons and electrons to form the other elements past that, because as soon as you add an extra proton and electron, it's so unstable that it breaks apart immediately. So in order for this to happen at all, it had to have incredible fine-tuning. So as an atheist in 1960, this is what Fred Hoyle said. Religion is but a desperate attempt to find an escape from the truly dreadful situation in which we find ourselves. Here we are in this wholly fantastic universe with scarcely a clue as to whether our existence has any real significance. No wonder, then, that many people feel the need for some belief that gives them a sense of security. And no wonder that they become very angry with people like me who say that this is an illusion, that it's illusory. In other words, he's saying religion is nonsense in 1960. But after spending decades researching carbon, listen to what he says. A common sense interpretation of the facts. Common sense, right? Which I've learned over years of living that common sense ain't so common. A common sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with physics as well as with chemistry and biology, and that there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. This is a perfect example. He's the poster child of this statement that Brian shared, that a little bit of science might lead you away from God, but a lot of science is going to lead you right back to Him. Now, I want to focus in on these 3 elements of the periodic table and a couple others as well. This is what forms life right here. So nitrogen is necessary for amino acids, proteins, DNA, RNA, ATP, chlorophyll, and many other biological molecules. Guess what our atmosphere is made of? Everybody take a big deep breath. I'm just putting on my Brady White hat for a second. Deep breath. What did you just breathe in? We know oxygen, but oxygen's actually only about, I'm rounding, 20% of the air that we just breathed in. Why does that matter? Our atmosphere is perfectly fine-tuned. Brian touched on this a little bit. The studies show if the oxygen in the atmosphere was more than 25%, lightning would be explosive. It would literally be explosions in the atmosphere. If you've ever seen a truck carrying liquid oxygen, what does it say on the truck? No smoking. Why? Because it's extremely flammable. You have to have oxygen in order to have fire, but if you have too much oxygen, you've got too much fuel for that fire and it's going to be out of control. So in order for fire to be able to be controlled, you have to have just the right level of oxygen in the atmosphere. Roughly 80% is nitrogen, which all life depends on. Nitrogen is what plants primarily use to make green leafy material. And the green is for chlorophyll, which is where photosynthesis is happening in those chloroplasts that we talked about. So here's where it gets so fun. Nearly 80% of the atmosphere is nitrogen, 20% is oxygen. Argon is roughly not quite a percent. CO2 is roughly 0.5%, and then water vapor varies. Obviously, it's very different in Arizona than it is here in Florida, where we have these humid blankets. So you're going to have much more water vapor in the atmosphere in more humid climates. Then, amino acids are made from these 5 things: nitrogen, oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, and sulfur. And DNA is made from these 5 things: nitrogen, oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, and phosphorus. So we have everything that we need to support complex life right here in our atmosphere, just about. Now, why do I have this picture of a glass of water over here? It is perfectly fine-tuned that the molecular weights of nitrogen and oxygen are very, very close to each other, which allows them to mix together. If you've ever done the little science experiment where you put water and oil in a glass, they're going to separate. Why? Because the molecular weights are different. If this was reality for oxygen and nitrogen, what would happen is, let's say hypothetically, oxygen was heavier by a significant portion than nitrogen, then all of the oxygen would settle close to the earth because of gravity, which means we would have a much higher percentage of the atmosphere that we are breathing would be oxygen, which again is problematic because you're going to have lightning creating explosions. You're not going to have the nitrogen available and accessible to plants to be able to photosynthesize and build the elements of life, and vice versa. If nitrogen was significantly heavier than oxygen, then it would settle, oxygen would rise to the top, and we would not have access to oxygen. So the fact that these have just the right number of protons and electrons, that means their molecular weights are roughly similar, is what allows them to mix in our atmosphere in order for this to happen at all. Now, this nitrogen bond, N2, is what's called atmospheric nitrogen. It's the gaseous form of nitrogen. It has a triple covalent bond between those 2 nitrogen elements. That is an extremely strong bond, very, very difficult to break. There are 2 things, and only 2 things in nature that can break this bond. One is lightning. The other is an enzyme called nitrogenase, which is a nitrogen-fixing bacteria, which I'll talk about in just a second. Again, a biochemical factory that is able to do something that only the power of lightning can do, to split this triple covalent bond. Now, here's what's fascinating. When it rains, especially when lightning strikes, that lightning makes the atmospheric nitrogen more available for the rainwater to absorb the nitrogen and deliver it down to earth. So thunderstorms aren't only watering your plants, it's feeding them. Now there's a sermon in there, right? The thunderstorms actually are feeding us and making us stronger. So, an incredible reality here. Now, I want to look at the nitrogen cycle here. We have nitrogen-fixing bacteria, which is a symbiotic relationship with certain kinds of plants, nitrogen-fixing plants, that have this symbiotic relationship where they literally talk to each other. There's an extraordinarily complex communication and information sharing system in nature, so much so that a friend of mine is working on a book to study the literal bartering system that happens between plants and soil organisms, because it's so efficient that it could actually improve our human economic systems and the way that we deal with things. There's actually even consequences for bad actors and things like that. So it's an extraordinary thing that we have a lot to learn from. Now, plants and organisms cannot break that triple covalent bond in atmospheric nitrogen. So it needs something to do that. Lightning is one thing. The other thing is this nitrogen-fixing bacteria. Inside that bacteria is an enzyme called nitrogenase, which is a brilliant little biochemical factory that's able to take atmospheric nitrogen, split it apart, and make it available into a bioavailable form so that plants can consume them. Here's where it gets fun. The plants and these bacteria talk to each other. It's almost like they knock on the door. The plant says, hey, who is it? And then they open the door and the bacteria come in and signals back to the plant, hey, I'm here, let's get started. So then the plant begins to build these little biochemical factory chambers, these little laboratories that have to be designed just right because you have to cancel out, you can't have oxygen in that system. So it's got to be built just right in order for that laboratory to do the work that it needs to do. But here is the phenomenon that is amazing. The DNA, because DNA is the instruction manual, the building plans for construction, if you will, the DNA for these little nitrogen-fixing root nodules in the plant roots, the DNA that tells those things how to be built is in the plant, but those little rooms are designed for the bacteria. Let me say that again, because the implications of this are big. The DNA, the building plans, the blueprints for these little nitrogen-fixing laboratories. The DNA to build them is in the plant, but they're designed for the bacteria. In other words, these have to go together at the same time. So not only do you have the complexity of this, you have to have the complexity of the bacteria and all of this design to go together. How does this get built in small successive changes over time? This is where the naturalist narrative just falls apart, and it falls apart in many places, as we've talked about over the last 5 weeks. But this is magnificent. That little biochemical enzyme is incredibly powerful and efficient. So, the secret sauce to regenerative agriculture is microbes. They are literally a fertilizer factory in your soil. I think many of you know my story. I'm actually a farmer, created a nonprofit 20 years ago called Do Good Farm that exists to end hunger and malnutrition by teaching people to grow their own food. And we kind of stumbled upon this accidentally because some of the projects that we are doing are in remote parts of Africa where you don't have access to conventional farming equipment and supplies and fertilizers and herbicides and pesticides and things like that. So I began to study the way that nature works, and the more that I realized how brilliant it is, the more that I realized the missional implications of it, because now we get to teach people how to use natural ecosystems to grow food and then ultimately point them to the designer who designed it all to work in the first place. But the rainforests and jungles have been growing trees and plants for thousands of years. No farmers, no fertilizers, no herbicides, no pesticides, no fungicides. By the way, anything that says "side" on the end of it is a killer, literally kills. And then lakes have been growing lily pads for thousands of years without farmers. So what we are doing is using these two ecosystems, combining them together and designing farms that can produce food forever once they're set up in the middle of a remote bush of Africa. And as long as they're maintained, they'll produce food forever. So I want to talk a little bit about this incredible system. These bacteria are literally a fertilizer factory inside your soil. And this gets so fun. Suzanne Simard, researcher, does forestry work up north near the Canadian border. She has done a ton of amazing research on how fungal networks in the soil literally allow plants to communicate with each other, and they've been able to isolate these plants and prove how they share information across these fungal networks. And visibly, when you look at these fungal networks, they literally look like brain neural networks, and they actually function that way in the soil in the way that they are able to communicate, facilitate communication, transport nutrients. And so literally plants will say, hey, bring me this, bring me this, bring me this, and they will do it. Bring me this pest control, bring me this disease control, bring me more nitrogen, bring me more phosphorus. Because what's happening is they've studied the soils in mature forests that clearly are living and doing fine. And the nutrients available in a soluble form, in a water-soluble form in the soil are close to zero. Whereas the recommended amounts for conventional agriculture, in other words, if you want to grow corn or soy or whatever it is that you're growing, you have to have certain amounts of soluble nitrogen and potassium and phosphorus and all this stuff in the soil, or the plants won't grow. Well, this narrative completely makes that look like nonsense because it's not in the soil. So what is happening? The bacteria, these literal fertilizer factories, are making them for the plants as the plant needs them. So the plant's saying, I need more nitrogen. Great. It makes it. It converts the minerals in the soil into what the plant needs. So it's literally nutrients on demand because of this extraordinary communication system that's happening in the soil. Now what happens when you spray synthetic fertilizers, herbicides, pesticides, fungicides onto your plants and onto the soil is now it kills your fertilizer factory, which makes you dependent on synthetic fertilizers indefinitely, forever. Well, that's good for agriculture because now you get to sell a lot more fertilizer and you get to sell more herbicides and pesticides and things like that. But in the history of ag science, there are two major forks in the road of history. Number one, in the middle of the 19th century, middle of 1800s, you've got germ theory beginning to develop because they are developing microscopes that are able to see these little bacteria that are not visible to the naked eye. And they're realizing that, hey, our beer and milk is spoiling and it's caused by these little things that we can't see with the naked eye. So he said, hey, if we kill the bacteria, if we sterilize it, pasteurization, Louis Pasteur, if we sterilize it, we kill the bacteria, now our beer and milk lasts longer. Yay, it's a win. But they did not realize at the time the unintended consequences that not only are you killing the bad guys, but you're also killing the good guys. And that sent us down a major path where I would offer to you that the bulk of ag science research since that time has been trying to solve the problems that one choice caused. They did not realize. And I talked to farmers today, literally recently, that tell me all I do all day is kill things. I go, if it flies, it dies, is a phrase that's often used in conventional agriculture. And they literally go around killing bacteria and fungus and all the stuff, right? Now, fast forward to after World War II, companies that were started and built upon creating chemical warfare for World War II. Now the war is over, what are they going to do? They take the same chemical formulas, or roughly the same chemical formulas that they were using to make bombs, chemical warfare, and now we say, hey, these can be used to kill these harmful pests and bugs and herbs and weeds and things like that. So now we're taking these same chemical formulas and now this is a good idea. Let's spray it on the food that we eat. So this created a culture within agriculture that is literally killing us. And I want to go through some of the consequences of these two major historical choices and how they are impacting us today. Number one is erosion. When we have centralized all of our growing to a few farmers to provide the world's food, then when you have this in your crop cycle, everything's been harvested, cleared out, now you're tilling and re-preparing the soil for the next round of crops. What happens when you get a big weather event with this? What does it do? It washes away all your topsoil that you've worked so hard to create. And what we're seeing is massive conversion of soil into dirt. And I want to define my terms a little bit because this might rub some people the wrong way. The way that I'm defining soil is a combination of the minerals in the dirt, if you will, and the living microbes in the soil. In a single handful of healthy soil, there are more microbes in that one handful than there are humans that have lived in the entire history of humanity. Over 100 billion microbes in a single handful of soil. But what we've done is we've converted it into dirt. We've killed all of the living systems that are in the soil and converted it into just the minerals that are there. And so much so that the UN and other organizations have said we essentially have about 50 years worth of crop cycles left in order to provide food for the planet if we don't do something different. In other words, this approach is not working. Now, what happens when you till your soil? If you are a microbe, a beneficial bacteria or fungi, it's like a hurricane coming through your house. It's not good for the establishment and development and maturing of a soil. It's literally saying, hey, we're going to we make some progress, and then boom, we take it back to square one over and over and over again. Then what happens when you have that part of your crop cycle? You've harvested everything, you've cleared it all out, you till the soil, you get a weather event. What does that also do to your soil? We know this from construction. That water is used to do what to soil when you're building a foundation for a building? Compact, right? What do you do when you compact? You're forcing the oxygen out of the system, right? Here's why this is problematic. I'm going to oversimplify this, but the research is showing that the good guys, the beneficial fungus and bacteria that plants need, these biochemical fertilizer factories, they're based on oxygen enzymes. In other words, they need oxygen to do the work that they do. When you don't have those there, it actually helps the bad guys, Salmonella, Ecoli, other things that thrive in oxygen-depleted environments. They're called anaerobes, right? So you have aerobic organisms, and then you have anaerobic organisms. The good guys, the ones that we want in our ag systems, thrive in oxygen-rich environments, which means you want a lot of air. The best way to do that is to have a microbe-rich soil, because it creates these pathways for earthworms and other things to allow air to stir it up naturally so that air can be in there, which air has nitrogen-fixing bacteria, make fertilizer for the plants. So we are literally turning soil into dirt. It has also decreased the nutrient density of what we are eating. This is well documented in science. We are putting more fertilizer in our soil than we ever have, more nutrients in, and yet the food that we are eating is less nutrient dense than it ever has been. It's well documented that if you want to get the same nutrient value out of an orange today, even from just 40 years ago, you have to eat roughly 8 oranges. But they haven't updated the food pyramid, right? And we wonder why we have so many issues going on in our healthcare system today. What we are doing is not working. So inputs are increasing, nutrient density of the food is decreasing. So something is not working with this system, with the way that plants convert these nutrients into healthy food for us. We're also seeing a decrease in biodiversity. Bio meaning life, diversity meaning different kinds. When this is your picture of agriculture where all you're doing is monocropping corn and soy and other things, you don't have the diversity of plant life that we see in nature. How many of you have done some hiking in the woods before? Have you ever seen nature monocrop, ever? Even when you find a pine forest in North Florida, those were planted by farmers. That is not what nature does. You see rich biodiversity in nature. And if we start with the assumption that that is designed and not accidental and happenstance, then we ought to pay attention and say, why is that? Let's go figure out why that works for nature. How has that been growing for thousands of years without farmers and fertilizers and pesticides and herbicides? Let's pay attention to what that is doing. We're also seeing a reduction in carbon sequestration. Why? Because when this is your picture of farming and there's no plants there for a part of the year, you don't have plants to breathe in the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So what we want to do is we want to have a healthy carbon cycle where we are removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And plants breathe that in. They sequester carbon out of the atmosphere and infuse it into the soil. So when this is your approach to farming, and you never have an empty field ever because of the way that you intermix and intercrop things together, you never lack carbon sequestration with that model of farming. We're also seeing a reduction in our pollinator population. Nearly 70% of the world's food supply is tied to pollinating insects. And what we're seeing is massive quantities of bees. You might have seen a documentary on Netflix called Bees or something like that. I can't remember exactly what it was called. Anyway, but we're seeing near conventional agriculture, these massive quantities of beehives that are literally just dying. Why? Because when we spray our plants, this is a pepper flower. When we spray them with herbicides, pesticides, fungicides, and then pollinators come and get nectar from these flowers, it's killing them off in huge quantities. Well, 70% of our food supply is tied to pollinating insects. That's just dumb. We can't keep doing it this way, right? So it's reducing our pollinator population in huge quantities. It's also decreasing our food production. Now, If you've spent any time in conventional agriculture, I've just stepped on your toes big time with this statement. Because I've had passionate conversations with farmers that tell me without these synthetic fertilizers and the Haber-Bosch processes, which is how we create nitrogen fertilizer, without all of this stuff, we cannot feed the 8+ billion people on the planet. There are people that credit Haber, who is the Haber of the Haber-Bosch process, which is how we use a lot of energy and heat to convert atmospheric nitrogen into nitrogen fertilizer, that he literally changed the world, that we could not do what we do without him. And I just would say that that's nonsense, but that's a big can of worms to open. And if you're interested in that can of worms, come and find me and we can talk about it. But I would offer to you that is actually impacting negatively our food production, and here is part of the reason why. You remember I told you that we're putting more inputs in than we ever have before. What does that mean? It means farmers have increased costs to grow what they grow, which means it's much more difficult to be profitable as a farmer. And so what's happening is now we have third and fourth generation farmers that are getting these properties, these farms handed down to them from dad and granddad and their family, and they saw how hard they worked just to barely make ends meet. And now all of a sudden what's happening is now you have a developer come in and say, hey, I'll give you a few $1 million for this property so that we can build a development. And the farmer's saying, don't have to work like I saw mom and dad work, and then now I'm financially set for the rest of my life. Why wouldn't we do this? So we're actually seeing this. We just recently crossed the threshold in the United States where we are importing more than 50% of the food that we consume. Now, I would offer to you that also poses a little bit of a national security issue for us as well, right? If we can't grow the food that we need to feed ourselves, that's going to be problematic. So farms are closing at massive rates. Again, what we're seeing just is not working. And we're also seeing a shorter life expectancy. For the first time in recorded human history, except for the people that lived 800 years in Genesis, we are seeing your kids and grandkids are expected to live shorter lives than we do. What we are doing is not working. This is why we have this ag research group with the Discovery Institute that I was telling you about, that Brian Miller, who was our second guest speaker, third week of the class, he and I lead this research group so that we can study how God designed all of this to work so that we can operate more fully within the design that God developed for us. Major differences in the philosophy of science between naturalism or atheism and what I'm calling intelligent design, or TOBD. You might remember Steve Miller talking about the theory of biological design. The engineering research group is developing this to create a framework to explain a worldview of how the world actually works, that it is designed. Let's better understand the design. So look at the difference in this. With naturalism, with atheism, our goal is to control nature. It assumes poor design because everything's accidental and happenstance. We're going to accelerate evolution. Now, some of the most wretched things that humans have done to each other in history are because of an evolutionary worldview. Go look up eugenics in the early 1900s, literally gene cleansing. Literally genocide to eliminate weaker genes, because what does evolution, natural selection tell us? It's a narrative of survival of the fittest. So what we're doing is we're eliminating the weak ones so that we can create a more superior human race. Well, then that philosophy is what Hitler got behind, right? To create a better human race. So it's literally us saying, hey, we're going to take this naturalist narrative and press the gas pedal on it and make a superior human race. But you and I both know that every single human life is valuable. Versus an intelligent design framework and philosophy of science where we study the book of nature the way that the founding fathers of the scientific revolution actually did so that they could better understand and know the God who made all of this stuff. It assumes from the beginning that there's good design. Why does this matter when it comes to science? If I think that all of this is accidental and happenstance and I see something that doesn't make sense, I'm like, well, clearly that's just an accident of the evolutionary process. It doesn't make sense to pay attention to it. But when you assume that it's brilliantly designed, now every single thing makes sense to pay attention to. Even if I don't understand it, even if I wouldn't have designed it that way, it's like, it's a posture of humility, right? That says, hey, maybe this is more fascinating and brilliant than I thought in the first place. And then we study it so that we can operate fully within that design. This is, in agriculture, is destroying us. This is what we have to switch ag science to over here. And I think the data is showing it, and now I think we're at a place in our human history where people are willing to listen to this story. So I think this gives us a loud megaphone to point to a designer, because we're realizing we can't keep up with rising healthcare costs. We're dying faster than ever. There's more disease. There's more gluten intolerances and gut issues and all the things that are going on because of what we're doing to our food systems. So people are ready to pay attention to this. So I just would ask that you would pray for us as we do this work. Now, I want to close our time with some key concepts that kind of help wrap up everything that we've been talking about in a neat little bow. This idea that we go into in more depth in God's Fingerprints 1.0, which you can find on the Vine Apologetics website. This idea of irreducible complexity. An intelligent design scientist named Michael Behe coined this phrase when he was in one of his biology classes in college. He looked at a bacterial flagellum, which is the propeller that bacteria use to move themselves around. He's looking at all the different components of this, and he says, that's an outboard motor. What creates outboard motors? Engineers and designers, minds do. And then he realized, when you think about the narrative of natural selection, that it's small successive changes over time, passed on from generation to generation, a random accidental mutation happens that happens to create a benefit for the next life form so that it survives more so than the previous one. Therefore, you begin to reproduce this benefited life form, and so on until you somehow can explain all the life forms that we see. And what he realizes is that if you take any one of these parts away, the system doesn't function. So it all has to come together at the same time. And he used the mousetrap as a simplified example of this. You take any one of those parts of the mousetrap away and it does not function. Well, how does that impact the naturalist narrative? Suppose, hypothetically, let's just give them the benefit of the doubt that somehow this bacteria was able to form a tail. Didn't have all the engine parts to spin it, but is able to form a tail. That actually is a negative reality for this bacteria, because now it just causes it to flop around and it doesn't allow it to move efficiently in the system. So you have to have all of these in place at the beginning in order for it to have any benefit to the organism whatsoever. But it's so much more complex than that, because you also have to have the DNA and the molecular machines. This has to be built in the right order. You have to have timing sequences and logic systems and molecular machines that are literally constructing all of this stuff at the right time. So it's much more complex than this. And what we see with plant and soil ecology is that it's irreducible complexity on steroids. It's a mousetrap on steroids. Because now you have all of these organisms, these symbiotic relationships between nitrogen-fixing bacteria and plants, and fungal networks and plants, and pollinators and plants, that the bees need the nectar and the flowers can't reproduce without the bees. So what is the phrase that you hear in atheist narratives? If you watch any of these National Geographic programs, a very common word that I want you to listen for and pay attention to and let your ears perk up when you hear is co-evolved. I hear this a lot. These things co-evolved. What are they saying? These things depend on each other. They don't exist without each other, so they had to come into existence at the same time. So we're not just talking about the accidental formation of a single protein or amino acid or any of that kind of stuff like Casey talked about last week. We're talking about massively complex systems that have to come into existence at the same time. The natural selection narrative does not work in what we see. It doesn't explain the evidence in what we see, which is why I said in week 1, large numbers of scientists are leaving that and saying natural selection cannot explain what we see in biology. This is what is called obligate mutualism, which is simply big words for saying that they depend on each other, that they have to exist at the same time, they had to come into existence at the same time, or they don't survive. They are not fit enough to survive without what the other organism, the benefit that the other organism brings to the table. So that is one really important example for the evidence for the existence of God. The next one is bioinspiration. We are studying countless hundreds of different examples of things in nature so that we can invent or improve our own inventions. We've studied the eye to better improve our cameras. Brian talked about this a little bit. What happens when you're out in the Grand Canyon and you take this picture and then you bring it home and you show it to your family and you're like, oh, it was so amazing. And they're like, yeah, that's pretty cool. What's the phrase that we use? The pictures don't do it justice. Why? Because this camera is not nearly as brilliant and efficient and complex as the human eye. We figured out how to fly from studying birds. We are studying DNA to improve human data storage. We're studying gecko feet to improve our adhesives because they can stick when they need to stick and they don't stick when they don't need to stick. We are studying spider silk to improve our own materials. We are studying shark skin because they're realizing that it has very little drag in water in the way that they were able to swim. And so now we're creating ship coatings by studying shark skin. We're studying owl flight to make our flight systems less noisy, to make them more quiet. And then this goes on and on. I see these kinds of examples all the time. I'm going to play a little video for you and pay close attention to the language that is used in this little video. It just came across my social media feed. Let me give you a little bit of context here. So there's a problem with the high-speed train that they're developing in Japan, that when it goes into a tunnel, it creates this compression like a piston or like a bullet being fired out of a gun, that when it comes out on the other side, you have all this compressed air that can't escape fast enough, and so on the other side of it, it creates this loud bang that all the residents in the area are getting upset about. So they're trying to figure out how to make this thing better, more efficient and aerodynamic to be able to go through these tunnels and not create these loud bangs. And they begin to study the kingfisher bird. And listen to what he says here.
So the team fired model noses of many shapes into a pipe and ran them through a supercomputer built for space research. The shape the math kept settling on, the one that made the smallest wave, was almost exactly the kingfisher's beak. Sit with what that means. A team of engineers armed with a supercomputer, searching for the single best shape to move between two densities, landed on an answer a bird was already born with. The kingfisher's beak isn't a metaphor here. It is a solution to the same physics, computed by evolution across tens of millions of years and written into the animal's body. Nakatsu didn't borrow a pretty idea. He read an answer. There is something humbling and a little embarrassing in that. Our finest machine, chasing a shape a fish-eating bird had finished perfecting before our species existed. And when they finally built the nose that way, the results read almost like a typo. By Nakatsu's own account, the redesigned 500 series cut the pressure wave by about 30%, drew roughly 15% less electricity, and ran about 10% faster than the train before it. One shape, quieter, cheaper, and faster, all at once. So how do you beat a problem that grows with every kilometer of speed? You stop fighting the air and you learn to part it.
What are they saying? Isn't it miraculous? The magic wand of evolution over millions of years somehow engineered this system to be more efficient than our best efforts with supercomputers could create. He said, there it is. The lead researcher happened to be a bird watcher, and he realized that when kingfishers dive into the water, you've got this pressure that it happens really fast and they create almost no splash. Well, that's exactly what he's trying to do with a bullet train going through a tunnel. So he just looked at this bird and said, why don't we try that and see what happens? Lo and behold, it's the only solution that worked after years of research, to the point where they said, yeah, we'll never be able to go past 350 kilometers per hour or whatever it was. So they were literally ready to quit, and then said, look at that bird. Let's see what that does. and it worked. It's unbelievable. Why? If we realize that it's brilliantly designed, why don't we just assume that it's designed? Because we can't have God, right? This is why Paul said in Romans chapter 1 that God has made himself known, but people suppress the truth in unrighteousness because we want to be in control. Scientists don't want to give up control. What we're calling for is a posture of humility that says, hey, you are God, I am not. Let's put science back where it needs to be to go and figure you out because you are extraordinary and you are vastly more brilliant than we can ever be. If that's true, if the things that we are studying in nature clearly tell us that nature is more brilliant than anything humans have ever created and it's not even close, then God's word is trustworthy. This matters for your life. We have the opportunity to figure out how to live our lives by the designer who is vastly more brilliant than we ever could be. And you've heard me say this, don't pay attention to what I say or what Renaud says. Be a good Berean and go search the scriptures to see if we're accurately pointing you to the Word of God to help you better understand the Word of God. The only thing of value that we have to add up here is inasmuch as we point you accurately to the one who's got the entire source of good truth for our lives to live. This matters. This is why you're going to see an emphasis in the fall and beyond for being in the Word of God. We want to be a church family that's in the Word of God. Research and studies have shown that 1 day per week in the Word essentially has no impact on a person's life. 2 days in the Word per week essentially has no impact on a person's life. 3 days in the Word per week essentially has no impact on a human's life. 4 days per week in the Word of God, reading it, studying it, meditating on it, memorizing it, 4 days per week, it skyrockets. That now we see massive changes in a person's life and the choices that they make and the implications that come upon their lives and their families. We want to be a church family that's in the Word 4 days a week per more. So you're going to see this. This matters. If God is that brilliant, let's go listen to Him and pay attention to what He has to say for us. So bioinspiration is massive proof that there's a mind that created all of this that's vastly more complex and brilliant than our human minds. The next great line of evidence for God is this idea of chicken and egg problems that are all over. Dozens and dozens and dozens of chicken and egg problems. I want to go over just a few. Casey touched on this last week a little bit. So we know that DNA depends on molecular machines, biochemical machines, to build it, to compile the information that's in DNA. So DNA depends on molecular machines, but the information system to build the molecular machines is coded in the DNA. What does that tell you? This can't happen in small successive changes over time. It has to come into existence at once. Massive complexity beyond human comprehension has to pop into existence at once. Blind natural forces do not do this. Ribosomes, this is the little chemical factory, the biochemical factory, the molecular machine in your cells that builds proteins. Well, guess what? You need ribosomes to build proteins, but what are ribosomes made of? Proteins. All of that's encoded by DNA to tell it how to build itself. ADP, ATP, and ATP synthase. ADP, adenosine diphosphate, is the battery. ATP is the charged battery. All life depends on ATP to have energy to be alive. Well, it takes roughly 7 fully charged ATP molecules to build one ADP battery. In order for any of that to be there, you have to have ATP synthase, which is that hydroelectric generator, right? To generate the power to charge the battery, to have the battery charged to make the empty battery. All of that has to exist at once, and it's all encoded by that brilliant DNA. All of this has to come into existence at once. Every single life form on the planet runs on ATP. Without this brilliant molecular machine, what Nick Lane calls the most efficient machine in the known universe, without that, there is no life. Cell membranes are dependent on transport proteins. Cell membranes are the barriers around a cell that brilliantly keep the bad stuff out, keep the good stuff in, let waste out, and keep and allow the good stuff to come in. Literally selective. So they have to analyze what's knocking at the door to see if it's worthy of coming in, right? And you can't just have what I call a passive filter, like a sieve or a strainer for your rice at home, right? You can't just have that because sometimes the harmful molecules are smaller than the beneficial molecules. So you can't just control it by the size of the pore. It has to actually be selective to only let in the right things and open up for the right things and close the door for the wrong things. So there's analysis and logic decisions that are happening in that system. Well, that depends on transport proteins, which depend on cell membranes. Then you have these information logic systems. Casey talked about this last week. DNA in and of itself is essentially worthless. You have to have the molecular machines and the information logic systems to be able to analyze and use the DNA and make choices. And then you have DNA repair machines that are necessary because DNA can be harmed by infrared radiation and things like that. And so as DNA is copying itself, it literally has repair mechanisms. It also has the ability to correct itself. Error correction is built into that replication process so that it can make sure that it actually copies itself correctly. Otherwise, life deteriorates very quickly. So these depend on each other. They're encoded by the DNA. DNA replication, in order for this naturalist narrative to happen at all, it's got to be able to replicate itself. Well, that's dependent upon highly complex, brilliantly efficient replication machines. And then in order to have any of this system, you have to have a hugely complex inventory management system to make sure that all the components that outside foods are consumed and broken down, and so that these finer molecules can be created to then be rebuilt into what the body wants to build based on the building plans that the DNA encodes. It's unbelievable, the complexity here. And again, what you heard in that little video is that time, the magic wand of time, somehow does this. So I want to look at this narrative and see how possible this is. They throw Father Time in the gaps all the time and then accuse us of throwing God in the gaps of our understanding, but they wave that magic wand all the time. So I mentioned to you that amino acids is kind of like letters to proteins, which are the words. Here's a very simple example just to kind of help frame this math lesson for you. With 3 letters, you have 6 possible combinations of those letters, and these 3 happen to be words that are beneficial information. They have informational value. These are gibberish to us. So in this example, roughly half of these combination of letters yields a beneficial word. The rest is just waste. Casey talked last week, beta-lactamase is a common protein in bacteria. What are the odds that you have one beta-lactamase protein that's able to somehow form, that's roughly 250 amino acids long? The way that you come up with the number of combinations is that you do what are called factorials. I don't mean to get super complicated here. With 3 letters, you multiply 3 times 2 times 1. With 4 letters, you multiply 4 times 3 times 2 times 1, and that gives you the number of possible combinations of all of those letters. 5 letters, 5 times 4 times 3 times 2 times 1 tells you how many combinations. Well, that number gets massive real fast with 250 different amino acid combinations. You combine those all together and you get a massive. Well, how many of those combinations out of all the possible combinations actually yield a protein that is of any value whatsoever? It's 1 in 10 to the 77th power, which is a number that you and I just don't understand. So I want to look at how much time we've actually had in the universe. Let's assume for a moment that the naturalist narrative is true, that the universe is just shy of 14 billion years old. Just to give them that assumption to begin with. That's only 10 to the 17 seconds in the entire universe. In other words, if you tried a different combination of amino acids every second, you need 10 to the 77 seconds to get one beneficial combination. There's only been 10 to the 17 seconds in the entire universe. But that's not the Earth. The Earth has only been habitable, according to their narrative, for 4 billion years, which is just shy of that. And then life on Earth 3.5 billion years ago. So that if you're doing the math here, that's roughly 500 million years after life being habitable and after Earth being habitable and life first forming. Very short period of time when you're talking about numbers of this scale. In other words, there's just not enough time for this false narrative to actually play itself out. But this is not the most compelling argument in my understanding. I think the other examples that we're giving you are much more compelling, but the bottom line is they just don't have enough what are called probabilistic resources. So what do you do when you want to increase your chances of winning the lottery? You buy more lottery tickets, right? Well, this is where the multiverse theory has come from. There's no evidence, zero evidence for a multiverse whatsoever, zero scientific empirical evidence for it whatsoever. What are they trying to do? They're trying to understand these odds, because if we have an infinite number of universes, then all of the probability actually shrinks down to where it's very probable, right? So it's just, again, a false narrative that's being created just so that we don't have God. So, not only is there not enough time, but the science tells us that time destroys. It does not build. It does not create information. Ever. Never. It doesn't happen. So, to summarize all of this compelling evidence, we have the scientific principles that we covered in week 1. That information comes from intelligence. This is what we have observed universally 100% of the time. If there is specified complex information, it came from a mind. Messages come from minds. Information comes from intelligence. Second, all of these chicken and egg problems that we went over, all of these highly complex things that had to come into existence at once in order for there to have life. Bio-inspiration, we are literally studying nature because it is vastly more brilliant than the things that we are coming up with. Again, where is our humility in that? Why don't we just say, maybe we've got something to learn here? And they do, but it's just the light bulb's not going off there. And then logic programming systems, blind natural forces, there are only 4 in nature. How do you create logic if then computer program type things with blind forces? You don't. The only thing that's ever been shown to create that is a mind. And time is a problem, not a solution. So the evidence is overwhelming that God not only exists, but that he's good, that he's brilliant, that he's trustworthy, and that you are fearfully and wonderfully made. He went to extraordinary lengths. And like what Genesis tells us is that he made humans. He says, that's very good. Wow. I mean, it's just like he's just went into this great lengths to design you. That is how valuable you are. That's why Jesus in Matthew says that he feeds the birds of the air. He clothes the lilies of the field. How much more valuable are you than they? If you don't get anything from this class, is that just get this. Science tells you that you are loved by the creator of the universe. What an incredible reality that is. So I want to close our time with this video on beauty in plants in nature, and just pay attention to the implications of the words that are shared in this video.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
You're watching the launch of 1,000 flying machines, each exquisitely crafted to airdrop life throughout the earth. A dandelion puff exists for one crucial purpose: to disperse the flower's seeds as far as possible from the parent plant. Its component parts are well suited for the task. Dozens of individual seeds are attached to the head of this flower. Each is covered with microscopic hooks that will eventually help anchor them to fertile soil. A thin stem elevates a cluster of bristles called the pappus, and these filaments are engineered to respond to variations in the weather. On a rainy morning, the moist, heavy air makes extended flight all but impossible. every pappus reacts by closing tightly. But later in the day, when the air dries out and the temperature warms, the reaction is quickly reversed in preparation for takeoff. Under optimal conditions, a seed can stay aloft for more than 10 miles. At the University of Edinburgh in Scotland, a team of engineers discovered how these tiny mechanisms fly so well. Using a vertical wind tunnel, they photographed the dynamics of airflow around the seed. When currents passed between the bristles, a swirling whirlpool called a vortex ring formed just above the pappus. In nature, this pocket of low pressure sucks the parachute upward and stabilizes its movement as it's carried by the wind. Other studies have also revealed that the vortex's shape and ability to maintain its position are determined by the size and quantity of the bristles and the amount of empty space between them. Simulation models demonstrate that in a biological structure this small, the finely tuned airflow required for flight is the product of circular geometry with 92% open space and 100 thread-like filaments. Not surprisingly, that's the blueprint for the pappus of a typical dandelion seed. How well does this technology work? When compared to a conventional parachute, the pappus is at least 4 times more efficient at maintaining altitude and slowing the seed's descent to Earth. Sometimes the greatest displays of creative brilliance are discovered in the artwork's smallest details. Hidden masterpieces like this weathered cone on the limb of a knobcone pine. Each cone is an impenetrable fortress, strong enough to withstand the blows of a hammer, and a forest of seed-hungry predators. In all of nature, only one force can break their vice-like grip. The searing heat of a forest fire triggers an amazing chain of events. And when the temperature reaches 350 degrees, the resin melts and the cones begin to crack. By opening only partially and emitting a gaseous vapor, the seeds are insulated from the killing flames. Later, after the fire has passed and the air cools, the charred cones open fully. Then they release their seeds and the promise of a new generation. Think about it. Small packages of life engineered to be airlifted throughout a devastated forest, released from cones designed to open only when exposed to the heat of their greatest threat. Even if you don't know much about helicopters, it's obvious that this is a brilliantly engineered vehicle. The same holds true for this maple seed, a biological helicopter. Its story begins here. This limb is both a machine shop and a launch pad. Just one of the countless locations on Earth where maple seeds develop into mechanisms that botanists call samaras. They must each transport their precious cargo away from the shadow of their parent tree. Success is linked directly to their design. About 90% of the samara's weight is concentrated in the seed that forms its center of gravity, while its wing, that weighs only about 1/10 of a gram, is flat, thin, and asymmetrical. The samara's center of lift is located here. The wing and seed are covered by a network of branching veins that produce a rough, irregular surface texture, a key to hovering in the wind. These properties all converge in a remarkable aircraft, created to fall to Earth very slowly. That's an attribute essential for long-distance travel, and when conditions are right, a maple samara can sometimes stay aloft for more than a mile. When a samara drops from a branch, its heavy center of gravity flips the seed almost 90 degrees. Then, its center of lift quickly balances and levels the angle of the wing to trigger auto-rotation. The faster the samara spins, the slower it descends. And as its hang time increases, so does its potential to catch a favorable breeze and a long flight. Precise engineering is critical. Inside a wind tunnel, smoke particles, illuminated by a laser, reveal a miniature tornado swirling sideways above the wing's rigid leading edge. Known as beneficial turbulence, this churning vortex is produced by air rushing over the uneven surface of the wing. The result is a drop in air pressure that creates enough suction to pull the samara upward as it falls. This added lift slows the seed's rate of descent. Researchers have discovered that this natural airfoil is more efficient than a standard airplane wing or the blades of a helicopter. By any definition, this is an engineered system, and much more. You see, every maple samara contains a living organism. That means it's not only capable of flight, it can also grow and reproduce new life, generation after generation. Now that's an ability no helicopter or any other device of human invention can come close to replicating. These remarkable mechanisms, seldom observed at this magnification, are engineered and constructed to help ensure life on Earth. They are biological wonders, commonplace but extraordinary, devoid of muscle tissue, yet surprisingly dynamic. And their mobility has fascinated researchers from South Carolina to South Korea. This story begins with these small lavender flowers. The plant's scientific name is Erodium secutarium, but it's commonly known as storksbill. A week after blossoming, the petals wither to reveal these green striped pods. Inside their protective walls, 5 seeds quickly develop. Each seed is attached to a slender tail called an awn, and 5 awns per pod cluster together to form these narrow pointed extensions that measure 1 to 3 inches and resemble, you guessed it, the bill of a stork. Later, the pods die back to display their contents. 5 exquisite packages of life, signed, sealed, and ready for delivery. The storksbill now awaits the most explosive stage in its life cycle. As the seeds mature, the awns dry out and contract. In the process, elastic energy builds within them to the breaking point. The extreme torque generated by the twisting awns catapults the ripened seeds away from the parent plant. Now things really get interesting. Once on the ground, the ion reacts to humidity and quickly changes shape. On a dry afternoon, the cells shrink and the ion coils tightly. But when the humidity rises, the moist air triggers an opposite reaction and the ion uncoils. These alternating cycles of contraction and release produce motor action that causes the ion shaft, tail, and fine hairs to move the seed on its slow, relentless march. If the seed head locates a small hole or crack, it enters, then twists and burrows like a miniature bulldozer. Okay, now freeze the action right here. I want to show you why that seed's outer casing is an absolute masterpiece. Just look at its shape. Sleek, tapered, and perfect for pushing its way into narrow spaces. And that hook on the tip, it anchors the seed while it's drilling into the soil. Those rows of microscopic hairs are aligned to help drive it forward, even in rough terrain. While large cavities on top of the case collect moisture that may help germinate the seed inside. This is a complete package, with every module working together, so the seed can literally plant itself. But there's more on display here than just a fascinating biological system. Consider this: when we objectively study a mechanism like this, with an array of integrated components that result in nothing less than the generation of new life, there is only one realistic explanation for its being. The foresight and ingenuity of a mind that exists outside the natural world and created everything within it.
Let's go. That's so good. I mean, these are just 4 examples, and they're all over the place. So good. Hopefully, this inspires us to pay more attention to science, to slow down, to stop and smell the roses, to grab your magnifying glass as you're going down the West Orange Trail and just slow down and pay attention to the little details and wildflowers that are happening and stuff. And here's the reality. You are loved by this God. The entire purpose of humanity, the meaning of life that humans have been trying to uncover for thousands of years, since the beginning. The meaning of life is very simply this: to walk in an intimate, active, abiding, nonstop relationship with the Creator of the universe. That's why you were made. And I think you've heard me share this before. How many of you have seen a bad movie before? How many of you have walked out of a bad movie before? Why? We get so mad. Why? I just wasted 2 hours of my life. And we're furious, and we're going to go tell people, don't go see that movie, it's a waste of time. You go to a bad restaurant, you're going to tell somebody because, by golly, they just wasted your time and your money. Why don't we get upset when we're wasting years of our life not living in the fullness of who we were made to be? You were made to walk in an intimate, active, nonstop, abiding relationship with the Creator, brilliant Creator, who made all of this and loves you tremendously. He wants to hang out with you. Man, that's incredible. So, may this drive us into a deeper relationship with Him, to pursue Him.